So now that we understand some of the ways in which opacity can be modified here within the brush creator, I want to go ahead and talk about randomization. In order to do that, I just want to come over here and I want to go ahead and reset this brush back to this basic status that we had before. And I'm just going to come over here and hold down Shift and make a straight line stroke so that you can see this as a reference point. Now you're going to see we have a slider here for opacity jitter. And the important thing to understand about this is that right now we have zero jitter, meaning that we are not changing the opacity of these dabs randomly at all. As I increase the opacity jitter slider, I'm going to be moving between the current opacity and a value of zero. So an opacity jitter of 100 is going to be the same thing as moving between the opacity of 100 and an opacity of zero. So if I come over here and I hold down Shift and I go ahead and make a similar mark, you'll see that we're going to get a lot of variation between these dabs. Now, we can always do less than. So if I come over here and I set it for something around 20, what you're going to get instead is it's going to be going between 100 and 80 randomly. And if I come over here and hold down Shift and make a similar mark, you'll see exactly what I mean. So not as dramatic of an impact as what we had here. So the idea, again, is that whatever the current value is for the opacity jitter is going to move between that amount and whatever amount you have here on the slider is going to be negative from that amount. Now, that said, we can also combine this over here with the opacity via pressure. And what we're going to get in that case is that when we're going to be pressing lightly, the opacity is going to be lower than 100. So we're going to be going between 0 and whatever the current value is as determined by the pressure. So if I come over here, hold down Shift, and make a similar mark, you can see as I press lightly and as I press hard, it's going to constrain how much jitter we can get. You can see it never really got truly dark over here. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go ahead and now I'm going to reduce the spacing so that we're going to get these dabs very close to one another. And I'm going to come over here and do the same thing. So hold down Shift, make a straight line stroke, and you can see how that variation of the dabs is going to interact with one another as we build up our brush stroke. Now, that said, it's important to understand that when we're dealing with this, it's going to be different on a per media basis, meaning that when we're over here within watercolor or acrylics, we're going to have different controls for the amount of opacity that we're seeing that are constrained by the medium itself that are going to be different than simply adjusting the opacity slider here. The opacity jitter will affect those values as well. For instance, with watercolor, loading would be one that would be affected by the opacity jitter because it's going to be modified by the opacity value as well as the opacity pressure response. So all of these things together are going to yield some really interesting results. If I come over here and just clear this off for a second, I want to come over and talk about the size jitter. Now, currently we haven't said much about size because we have a size slider here and we've seen how that works. We also have some keyboard shortcuts that we can use for size. So if I hold down the Control key and I click and drag, you can see that I can go bigger or smaller in size depending upon whether I go left or right. So you can see how that goes. I can also use the bracket keys on the keyboard. So if I press the left bracket key or the right bracket key, I will be going up or down. And I can also press and hold. That will allow me to zoom up or down in size. And I also have over here a size pressure response. And this is going to be very similar to what we saw before. So if I simply come over here and set the opacity jitter back down for right now, and I come over here and I increase the size, you can see my stroke preview is going to be indicating that I get a very solid stroke that's going to be going between thin to thick and then back to thin again based on pressure. So if I just come over here and do this, you'll see that's what I get. And if I were to come over here and set this to a negative 100, it's going to be going between thick to thin as I apply more pressure and then back to thick again. So you can see how that goes. So we can obviously have this at any value in between and get a different type of result where it never gets as thin as that, or vice versa. We can make sure that the points never get that thin either. So these are things that you want to take into consideration, but it's important to understand that the multiplier and maximum only affect the opacity. They do not affect the size. So when you're thinking about modifying the size here, understand that this is sort of isolated, even though it's all grouped together. It is its own unique slider. Now, that said, if I come back over here and reset that brush back to its defaults again, I also have a size jitter slider, and it works exactly the same way as the opacity jitter slider. So here you can see that I currently have a size of 70, and I do not have any size pressure. So if I come over here and I increase the size jitter to 100, I'm going to be moving between the current size and a size of 0. And you can see that reflected here in my stroke preview. So if I hold down Shift and I go ahead and make a mark, you can see that's exactly what I get. I have very small dabs, very large dabs, and of course, if I reduce the spacing, you'll see that that is going to be true in a tightly spaced stroke as well. So we have some interesting possibilities as far as that's concerned. But we can also incorporate this over here with the spacing jitter and the scatter. And this will allow us to generate interesting looking brush strokes. So I'm going to come over here, hold down Shift, and make a straight line stroke. And you can see that instead of getting a stroke, what I'm getting is more of a drippy type of effect. This is very useful when you're going to be doing stamping techniques and you want to spray an effect over an area rather than simply making brush strokes. So it's a really good idea to keep this size jitter in mind. And then the other thing that you want to do is you also might want to incorporate a little bit of opacity jitter to increase the randomization that you're going to see. And this is going to yield very interesting buildup of effects, as you can see here. So the idea of these randomizers is that they're going to be really, really useful in terms of generating some types of random marks for stamping effects. And it can also be useful in terms of controlling the way in which your strokes are going to be building up. But the important thing to remember about them is that they're going to be in the context of your current size or your current opacity. And that is also going to be constrained by whether or not you have any size or opacity limitations based on pressure. So here you can see in my stroke preview that I'm going to be getting very thin, and I'm also going to be getting very transparent marks at the beginning. And then as I increase the pressure, it's going to be going out further. It's going to be larger dabs, and then it's also going to be potentially more opaque. And I'm going to get a result that looks something like this. So very interesting effects can be achieved by combining all of these things together. And of course, you can have them at any values that you need in order to get the specific effects that you want. Now that said, I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to reset that back to its default. I'm going to come over here and clear off that layer, and we're going to look at something different in the next video.